Looking for Mr. Douglas, London, 1846. Soon after entering the teleporter cloud, everything turned upside down and we began tumbling head over heels. I could tell that Tamika didn't like it one bit. She was really scared. My friend squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. After the upsetting ride, we made a soft landing in a park. It was cool and foggy outside, and a steady rain was falling. The professor quickly opened his umbrella. "I don't ever want to do that again," Tamika said as she shivered in the rain. "We'll have to go through the teleporter in order to get back home," the professor noted. "I've been through it many, many times, but I admit it is a little scary at first." Tamika and I huddled beneath the umbrella with Professor Tuesday. We looked around, but it was hard to see anything because of the rain and fog. The professor spoke softly. "There are no slaves or slave chasers in London in the 1840s, he said. "I should tell you that we have traveled to a place where cities and people are very different than they are in our time." He turned to Tamika and said, "But there is absolutely no reason to be afraid." "That's good," I said. Tamika agreed. The professor continued, "We will be walking into a city that will look like it came out of a Charles Dickens novel." "Charles who?" Tamika asked. "Charles Dickens," answered the professor. "He was an author in the 1800s who wrote several famous books. Many of them have been made into wonderful movies." Tamika and I just looked at each other and shrugged our shoulders. "We have no idea who you're talking about, Professor." "I know a movie you may have heard of," the professor said. "How about A Christmas Carol? You know, the movie that has Ebenezer Scrooge in it?" "I didn't like that movie," Tamika said with a sour look. "It's got a kid named Tiny Tim and some scary ghost things." "That's right," said the professor. "Charles Dickens wrote several books and all of them took place in the middle 1800s. If you've seen older versions of A Christmas Carol, you kind of get an idea of what we'll be seeing today." So the professor right now is kind of like telling them how the city's different and kind of what it looked like. Yep, he's comparing it to modern day. And another thing, people spoke very differently in those times, so I have Tuesday translators for you. While they are speaking the same language, words and phrases they chose are very different. He handed us little objects that looked like earbuds and he told us to put them in our ears. "You will be able to understand everything Mr. Douglas says, and if you would like to say something to Mr. Douglas, it will translate the words you say into words that he will understand." "Cool," Tamika said. We stayed close to the professor as he walked through what looked like a tree-lined park. Before long, we came to a street that was made out of stones pieced together. We saw a horse pulling a cart and driver. The cart bounced down the street as the horse's hooves made loud sounds on the stones. Clippity-clop, clippity-clop. "These streets look different than those in our day," the professor noted. "These are called cobblestone streets. People in carriages and carts had very bumpy rides over cobblestone roads, and we should be very careful when we walk. There are horse droppings all over the street." "What are horse droppings?" Tamika whispered to me. "You know," I replied. "Horse poop." "Oh, yuck," she said, making a face. From that point on, she was very picky about where she stepped. A row of buildings lined either side of the cobblestone street. Smoke rose out of chimneys on each roof, adding to the layer of fog that gathered around us. Everything was covered with gritty ash. As we walked, a young boy passed us carrying a huge bundle of rags. On a corner up ahead, a man was selling chickens. He held motionless birds by their feet as he called out to the people walking by his table. I've gone to the grocery store several times with my mother, but I've never seen a chicken being sold with its feathers still on. Right next to the chicken salesman stood an old woman selling vegetables. People in long frock coats walked alongside the road. Most of the men wore tall black hats on their heads, like the kind President Lincoln wore. The shirts that peeked out of their coats had ruffled fronts. Many of the women wore shawls and hats that were close to their heads. We walked past several houses and stopped in front of one that stood in the middle of the block. Professor Tuesday dug into his coat pocket and pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper. He looked at the paper and then at the address on the tall brick building. "This is it," said the professor excitedly. "This is where Frederick Douglass and his family live. I sure hope he's home today." We walked up the slippery stone steps to the doorway. The professor reached out a fist toward the thick wooden door and knocked loudly. We heard some movement from inside. The sound seemed to get closer and closer. Suddenly, the big door opened wide. A woman stood in the doorway. She was wearing a black dress with white lace around the collar. "Begging your pardon, madam," said the professor as he bowed deeply, "but is this the residence of Mr. Frederick Douglass?" "Indeed," the lady answered, "Mr. Douglass and his family live here." The professor and the woman at the door were talking funny. They used different words for things, and her accent was strange to us. It was hard to follow what they were saying. "My young friends and I do not have an appointment," the professor said. "However, we were hoping to meet the good gentleman." "Mr. Douglass is not in at present," she replied as the door swung shut in our faces. The confused look on our faces told Professor Tuesday that he had forgotten to turn on the Tuesday translators that were in our ears. "Sorry," the professor said as he turned on the devices. "It looks like Mr. Douglass isn't home."